Hello there, and welcome back to World Energy Week. Now, for those of you who have been with us, we've had a very, very busy morning, taking a look at Asia Pacific, taking a look at Asia, the role of gas, and really focusing on Russia and Kazakhstan. And one theme we heard without a doubt right through this morning, everybody talked about it from every country, everybody talked about hydrogen. So in just a minute, we're going to get to hydrogen. Just a reminder for all of you who have just joined us, I'm sure you're familiar with the screen. Remember, we are hashtag World Energy Week. So make sure to share us on social media and indeed get your questions ready, because we now have what I would call the power panel in so many ways. Everybody is talking about hydrogen. As I said, we've had it from every country, from every expert, from every representative, government officials, policymakers. This morning, we've heard about it yesterday as well. So now we have a complete dedicated panel. And we're looking at this to our title on this is Hydrogen, Avoiding the Trouble of the Bubble. And who else but to lead this panel for us, my dear colleague and good friend, I'm going to hand it over to Arthur Hanna.
And thank you very much indeed for the introduction. And like you said, I'm delighted and I'm also excited to be here this morning on a very sunny day. We're going to have a great discussion. You and I have been at a number of events recently where hydrogen has pretty well dominated an awful lot of what we've been talking about in the energy system. But I think the reality today is that hydrogen is an important part of a future energy system, but it is a future and we need to accelerate to that future. So again, hydrogen, avoiding the trouble of the bubble. What we're going to try and get to over the course of the next hour is to look at two what I would call exam questions. And the first one is the current hydrogen conversation focuses heavily on supply, overlooking the critical role of the hydrogen user. So that's the first aspect. You and I have been at these conferences where we've had every color of hydrogen from a supply point of view being talked about. That's been very much the aspect of it. And then the second basic aspect is demand-centric hydrogen perspectives are needed to facilitate the development of global value chains and fulfill hydrogen potential role as a clean energy vector. And I think this links into, again, a lot of debate and discussion that we've been part of, which has been about these pilots, whether it's the Swedish pilot on clean steel production in northern Sweden, whether it's pilots with regard to fuel cells and EVs, etc., etc. But we need to industrialize those demand centers. And I'm delighted to welcome my panel today so that we can have that debate and discussion. Ed, lovely to see you again, and we'll be back in about an hour's time to wrap up and get your perspective and my perspectives on the discussions we've had. Thank you for that.
We will indeed. I look forward to it.
So as I said, everyone, we have a great panel together for us over the next hour. Let me just quickly introduce you to them. We have Nobuo Tanaka, who's the Senior Advisor Hydrogen World Energy Council. That's to say that is his role now. Tanaka-san, as all of us I'm sure participating today, has been absolutely one of the pillars of energy debate, discussion, narrative, policy and direction, certainly in my time over the last 40 years in the industry. Tanaka-san, it's wonderful to have you. Fiona Simon, who is the CEO of Australia Hydrogen Council. Fiona, it's wonderful to have you joining us today. I think all of us are interested in what is happening in Australia in terms of the development of the hydrogen industry, and it will be great to get your perspectives. Mohit Bhargava, who is the CEO NTPC Renewable Energy Limited India. Mohit, it's wonderful to have you because you represent a major energy producer, a supplier, should I say, within one of obviously the markets that will dominate the way in which we think about energy transition over the next 20 or 30 years. So to get your perspectives from that market will be great. Jeroen van Hoof is the Global Energy Lead in Utilities and Resources for PwC. Jeroen, wonderful to have you here. You've spent most of your career within this sector. You'll be dealing with clients who are grappling with the issues of both supply and demand, and we look forward to getting your perspectives. And finally, we have Didier Holleaux, who is the Executive Vice President of Engie Engie in France. Again, a organization that is absolutely committed to the direction of a net zero future, new energy sources coming into energy systems, and it'll be wonderful to get Didier's view on this. In terms of the format for our discussion today, what I'd like to do is to invite each of our panelists to give their perspective on the exam question. In other words, do you believe that the current hydrogen conversation focuses too heavily on supply, overlooking the critical role of hydrogen users? We'll start with that question. We'll get our perspective from each of the panelists. Tanaka-san, I'm going to go to you first, then to Fiona. Mohit, you'll be third. I know you've just joined us, so just FYI, you'll be number 3 in the queue, Jeroen, and we'll finish off with Didier. We'll get some perspectives from each of the panelists, and then we'll move into some further questioning that sits around that. Questions around investment, questions around policy, questions around the role of government, questions around essentially how are we going to leverage hydrogen in the context of humanizing energy as we go forward. So on that, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very much looking forward to our discussion over the next 60 minutes. And maybe Tanaka-san, welcome. Maybe we'll start, if you don't mind, with your own thoughts of the bias that might exist in the way in which we think about hydrogen today. Have we focused too much on supply? What do we need to do going forward?
Yeah, that's Arthur. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk about hydrogen. Since the time of when I was in the IEA executive director, we talk a lot about natural gas, because natural gas may be a kind of golden age is coming because of the shale gas revolution in the United States. Of course, the gas supply, this is the supply side issue, but of course the demand of gas is increasing because gas is much cleaner relative to oil or relative to coal. So the use or demand side is expanding dramatically for the gas. That is the golden age, and it happened in the United States because supply side, thanks to the shale revolution, it creating a very cheap gas. And the pipeline system, which is readily available, provided the venue for the gas be transported, and the market mechanism there helps to build the gas golden age there. So will this happen to the hydrogen is a very, very interesting question. I am now saying maybe the golden age of hydrogen is now happening. Of course, it depends on many issues of supply side, demand side, etc. But if there are more than 120 countries already announced carbon neutral by 2050. Well, China is 2060, but anyway, if the governments want the carbon neutral by that time, definitely hydrogen is mandatory or necessary, because without hydrogen, there's no solution for the very hard to abate sectors. And IEA pointed out the issue is in Asia, because Asia is growing rapidly, the ASEAN countries, India, China, and they need energy, and especially the heavy industrial sectors and heavy road trucks and buses. They are the very young infrastructure, and these young infrastructure need much longer time for depletion relative to developed economies. So using hydrogen in these economies may help to decarbonize these heavy industrial sectors, steel, cement, coal power plants, etc. And maybe transportation could be treated much easier because their depletion time is much shorter. But IEA's view is that hydrogen is a kind of common solution for this energy transition. It helps also not only Asia, but oil and gas producers, because they don't want to see the stranded assetization of their resources. So making a blue hydrogen with CCUS, certainly they can live with the energy transition. Of course, at that juncture, supply side of the gas, oil, the price of supply of gas and oil becomes zero, because marginal cost of wind and solar is zero. So it should go that direction. And but at the same time, these producers can sell the CCS, the carbon sequestration, as a special service, adding onto the hydrogen from gas and export it through the new value chain or supply chain. For the renewable rich region like Europe, yeah, it offers the storage of excess electricity. So using the electric system or hydrogen pipeline system, this is a new buffer of electricity supply gap of demand and supply, and help to use more and more renewables. And this helps the sustainability, but at the same time, for Europe, this is the energy security against Russia, against Middle East, or against to the United States. They need energy independence by renewables. So hydrogen helps their strategy. Japan is aiming at green hydrogen supply chain, connecting these, green or blue hydrogens. Japan has led the hydrogen economy since Toyota Mirai, the fuel cell vehicle, from 2014. The first strategic plan was made by the Japanese METI in 2017. There was no country who were talking about hydrogen at the time. Then came China, Korea, China, and now Europe is the hydrogen economy itself, or trying to be the hydrogen economy. So everybody is talking about hydrogen. So Japan is overtaken by Europe and China. But last year, the former Prime Minister Suga declared that Japan should be carbon neutral by 2050. And this is a shock wave in the Japanese industry. And METI revealed the green growth strategy. And this covers a lot of hydrogen in the demand side, not only in the fuel cell vehicle, but the ships. The ammonia could be a very important fuel for the sustainable shipping, airplanes, petrochemicals, like iron, steel making, cement. So the demand side is certainly the very important part of METI's industrial policy. And in fact, I think this METI's declaration of green growth strategy is a kind of new, interesting way of manifest of Japan returning to the leadership role of the hydrogen from now on. Japan had started LNG business 50 years ago. Nobody cared about LNG at that time, but Japan needs clean fuel, LNG gas, by importing as liquefied form. So from Alaska, that was the first endeavor, and then other countries in the ASEAN countries, and then Middle East. So after 50 years, LNG became commodity. So supply side, I think Japan should move from LNG to hydrogen. It could be either liquefied hydrogen by Kawasaki Heavy Industries, or it could be organic hydrate by Chiyoda Engineering, or fuel ammonia. This is Sumitomo Chemical, and the others are trying to use ammonia for power sector. The JERA, the Japanese Tokyo Electric and Chuba Electric joint venture, is starting the idea of co-firing ammonia, clean ammonia, with coal power plant, and introducing gas co-firing with, hydrogen co-firing with gas turbine. So this is definitely the big change. This is the biggest change in the demand side. Fuel cell vehicle was too small in the demand, in the volume. But now Japan is moving to the industrial side, like steel, cement, petrochemical, and coal or power plant side. So this is the solution and entrance to the golden age of hydrogen. That is my first initial statement. Thank you very much.
All right, Tanaka-san, thank you for that. And good to, as you say, looking at the analog of LNG and where Japan took the lead on that. But as you mentioned, That was 50 years or so ago. We don't have the 50 years to get to the golden age of hydrogen. And that is part of our problem, I think, in energy, is that transitions do take between 50 and 60 years. History tells us that. We need to change history, and we need to accelerate at a much faster pace. So I'd like to come back and examine that in some more detail. Fiona, I'd like to go to you next, if that's okay, to get your perspectives on are we biased on looking at supply? We've had a fantastic overview from Tanaka-san, but interesting to get your perspective as someone who's been in the industry, but also your role now in Australia as well.
Right, thank you so much. Well, certainly in Australia, there's a bias towards supply. And I think that probably reflects a political reality. And maybe the reasons for that political reality are really the same around the world anyway. I think there's a phrase that's used in Australia for the low emissions technology sort of work that's happening and politics that are going on. And we're saying technology, not taxes. And so it's a sort of politically safe and sanitary way to not, to be focusing on the supply and focusing on technology with the view that that's going to get us, to this end goal of net zero or zero emissions at least. When at least in Australia, if one was to talk about demand too much, one would then get caught in things like carbon pricing and carrots and sticks. That then start to penalise those industries that the economy still relies upon, and that and that politics and political parties still rely upon. So I would say there is certainly here a focus on supply over demand. We are very much of the view that we need to focus on demand to bring through supply, and that's a key focus for us at the Australian Hydrogen Council. It's trying to get that social, regulatory and economic licence to operate through focusing on demand and policy settings to grow that demand. But yes, I don't know the degree to which others feel that supply is a safe political option, but that's certainly how it looks to me in Australia.
Interesting. And I'd like to come, I mean, that's just saying it as it is, which is great, because I think that sets a good place for us for discussion. But you mentioned some of the orientation. Obviously, you need to stimulate demand for that supply to meet markets. And I'd like to come back on that a little bit later when we look at our secondary question, if that's okay. Mohit, I'd like to go to you and your orientation. Again, do we have a bias towards supply, or what is your view on that? And both from your own market and your own observations of what's going on in the global energy market as well.
So good afternoon, Arthur, and thanks for connecting, and thanks to World Energy Council for having me here. In terms of bias towards supply, I think this is a question we did envisage, and I'm actually happy to inform that the government has been focused on this. And what we try to do is that while we have focused on getting people on board for the supply side, the government is also contemplating, and that's going to be part of the National Green Hydrogen Mission, that how do we get people on board in terms of demand? And one of the tools which the government had used earlier on also to accelerate the adoption of the renewable energy in India is to mandate consumption. For high user industries like refineries, fertilizers, natural gas blending, and so on and so forth. And going forward also maybe steel would be part of that. So as we understand, one of the important things which the government is contemplating is to create a mandated green hydrogen consumption obligation, or it could be green hydrogen ammonia, a green ammonia consumption obligation.
Okay.
What that will do is, in whatever amount of hydrogen or ammonia is being consumed by these set of user industries, they will have to mandatorily use a particular portion, maybe say starting with 1% of the consumption today, or 2%, whatever that number could be, the starting number, and that can go up to 25% by at the end of, say, a decade. So that takes care, as we feel, that there will be people who are clearly identified and mandated to offtake. So what that will do is that will create demand. And on the other hand, not to create a situation where people are forced to buy this at a very higher cost, the government is also planning to come out with a bid process This is again a template which the government had used earlier in the adoption of renewables. We went ahead and we started inviting bids on the basis of tariff. And if that's the similar potential is definitely available in the case of whether it's hydrogen or ammonia. And let me tell you, in the case of India, it's largely going to be renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen. Because as it is, most of our refineries are actually using a gray and they're trying to look at the blue part. But we feel that India being having a huge resource and very resource rich in terms of renewable, and we have been able to actually bring down the cost of renewable. I mean, just as an example, almost 10 years ago when we started off in India on the renewable side, the bids came in at about 20 US cents per kilowatt hour. And today we are at less than 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's the trajectory the Indian renewable sector has traversed. And this is on the back of practically every large fund house, private equity fund, sovereign wealth funds who have backed a whole host of private sector developers. And as a government company, which NTPC is today, we have also started participating in these reverse auctions, and we have been winning the bid. So that gives certainty of supply at a very, very reasonable rate. And that also gives a certainty of demand. And once we have that, we are quite sure the template which the government had used on the renewable side can actually be replicated much more in a much faster manner because the market is more mature. People are ready to do their bit. For example, we have been offering, and this is a very august gathering in terms of their knowledge about hydrogen. So one of the biggest challenges, as I understand, we face, other than the demand side, is also in terms of cost. So we have been saying that India has the potential to actually break the $2 per kilogram of cost barrier on the green hydrogen side much faster. It's not the 10, 12 years or 2040 what people are talking about. It can possibly be done in the next 5 years, and which is quite doable. So the government is supporting the demand side, mandating through mandates, and which will also give them options to, give them some certifications. That's all part of the likely policy which is going to come. So we feel that supply and demand both need to be balanced, and which is what the government of India is doing. But I do agree, Arthur, that globally, probably this was one part. Maybe a lot of people were blindsided. I'm not really sure. I can't comment on how the policies have been formulated in our countries. But I'm quite sure this is something which is going to happen because we also very strongly feel, and I heard one of the points Tanaka-san made, that in terms of mobility, hydrogen or FCV is actually a very small component. Yes. And we totally agree with that. Yeah. The consumption of green hydrogen will happen much more on the industry. And hydrogen, green hydrogen, has the potential of actually decarbonizing not just the power sector. Power sector, we are doing enough on our side. We're doing a lot of renewables, we're doing so many other things. Okay. But these are the industries which were hard to abate and so on and so forth, which can potentially decarbonize using green hydrogen.
Mohit, thank you for that. And again, that's been an interesting kind of adjunct to the other two comments. I mean, one of the points that I suppose that stuck in my mind when Tanaka-san was talking about, linking back to the LNG analog of transition is that shale made LNG cheaper. As a consequence of that, demand, basically was created because actually it was price competitive with other energy sources. And that is not the case as of today when we think about green hydrogen. So it's been interesting getting the perspective of India in terms of, I was going to ask, you can mandate green hydrogen, but how do you deal with the cost penalty that potentially today is in place for organizations to move that? So it's interesting to get your perspective of, you feel that price competitiveness can potentially happen within about 5 years. It's not 10, 15 years out, which was actually the challenge in the IEA report that just came out earlier this week. So let's come back on that a little bit because I think that's a template for what needs to be thought about in other markets as well, I believe. Great, thank you for that, Mo. That's super, good to get that perspective. Jeroen, be great to get your insight from dealing with obviously a wide variety of clients, presumably both on the supply and demand side. Again, your thoughts and your view about the bias on supply, or whether that's not the case. Be interested to get your views.
Yeah, sure, Arthur. Thanks. And well, I think a lot has been said already, but just stepping back a little bit, and you referred to the IEA report previously, a massive scale-up will be required when it comes to green molecules entering our primary fuel system if we want to meet the Paris goals in any case. And I think it's also quite clear that in terms of hydrogen being economically viable, we're not where we should be. So I think most experts agree that before 2030, this will not be the case. Probably we'll see something similar like we have seen in solar and wind in the past to pass the valley of death of technology and become economically viable will take some time. However, I think the demand point is a fair point, but if we want to scale up to the levels that are required to meet those goals after 2030, it is crucial that actually now, today, we will invest in setting up the right infrastructure. And with infrastructure, I do not only mean grid, but I also mean the network backbone, obviously, but also storage, fuel stations, and port infrastructures that will be required to deal with larger flows later. So what I'm saying is setting up this grid now in combination with pilots is crucial to serve future demand. I think in doing so, and that's where the importance of demand kicks in, we need to think carefully with policymakers and business and collaborating strongly. I think that's an important topic here. We think by region, or need to think by region, where pockets of potential demand will sit. And that means actually that supply centers and demand clusters will need to be identified, and the investments that are required to set up the infrastructure now should be then stimulated in that direction. There are excellent examples on that. I think if you look in Northwest Europe, we'll see some of that in the hydrogen backbone that is currently being developed. And thinking that through carefully will enable those two things, supply and demand, to meet. But there is obviously a chicken and egg thing to be resolved here. So I think that is an important point I wanted to make. And then I think policymakers will need to think about how to stimulate demand. That's the next thing. And stimulation of demand and making sure there's a level playing field, both for established energy players and new disruptive players, is crucial. And the answers to that might differ per geography as well. Pricing carbon obviously is an element that will have a goal here. We can discuss maybe in a later part of this session. But thinking about that in terms of demand and level playing field is another point I wanted to make in my introduction, Arthur. So. No,
that's great, Jeroen, and thank you for that. I agree. You touched on aspects of infrastructure, collaboration, and also the kind of the issue of carbon pricing, or recognizing that price somehow in terms of the supply-demand systems that emerge as we go forward, and the role of government in terms of policy and standards that will be needed. Didier, maybe if I can come to you and get your perspective to finish this the first half of our discussion.
Thank you, Arthur, and thanks to World Energy Congress to invite us to give an opinion on this issue of supply and demand and hydrogen. Perhaps I should start by saying where I'm speaking from. Engie is an energy company, but it's an energy company with a purpose. And our purpose is to act to accelerate the transition towards a carbon neutral economy, which means that we have quite a specific position, and we are in dialogue with our customers about how do we help them to go to their transition. So coming to the issue of hydrogen, yes, as Jeroen just said, it's a matter of chicken and egg, quite a traditional one, and you need to start somewhere. And I think there is quite a consensus that you need some green hydrogen to start the process. Just let me take an example. I'm one of the very few people in France driving a hydrogen car. But to this point, I have to fill up most of the time with gray hydrogen because there is not enough station with green hydrogen available. Just because technical regulation is not up to date, because it's almost impossible to build a green hydrogen filling station rapidly in an area like Paris and the suburbs. So if you don't start with the green hydrogen production, you may be stuck with this kind of awkward situation. That being said, I see a very limited risk, at least from Engie perspective, that we could be in a kind of bubble, as you mentioned. First, because as Engie, we start all our hydrogen project by speaking with our customers. And our projects are only being developed if we find a customer, and we start with an anchor customer who is ready to take significant amount of green hydrogen because they want to go green. It may be fertilizer industry, it may be explosives, it may be mining industry. We have very many different cases, and some of these projects are already public. But we always start with an anchor customer who is ready to take the bulk of the production. And then, once we have created this production and a flow of hydrogen going to an industrial customer, we look around, and that's where mobility comes in. If we can find other customers for smaller quantities, in order to build up on this initial production for an industrial customer, a bit of a bigger production at marginal cost for mobility or for smaller use like semiconductor industry or industry which consume just a few hundreds of kilograms of hydrogen or things like that. And we try to create a hub. And that's how we work. And that's why we believe that the risk of bubble is non-existent for us, because so far we have found a significant number of customers who are ready to start committing. Obviously, most of these projects need subsidies in the first stage. So we are also in dialogue with the government to make it possible. But we believe that it will avoid for us the risk of a bubble. Let's also say that we believe that the bubble can be avoided by carefully drafted policies by the government. And Mohit did mention mandates. So mandatory use of a certain percentage of green hydrogen for big industries or smaller industry, doesn't matter, will create a certainty of demand, which will allow the development of this project. So it's in the hands of the government through this mandate to make sure that we will avoid any bubble, because green hydrogen will always find a market provided that the right regulatory environment is in place. Third, but also important, Jeroen mentioned it, we believe that infrastructure is essential. Hydrogen storage, hydrogen pipes, hydrogen fueling station, and a market for hydrogen will allow very easily to move hydrogen around to customers which may not be in the best place to produce the green power, but which are good customers, good consumer for hydrogen. And we believe that this infrastructure will probably start locally in industrial regions, connecting important customers with some producer. But very rapidly, you will have to interconnect this region. You will have to develop massive storage in salt cavities. And by doing so, you will allow hydrogen to find its market more rapidly and in a more economical way, because then the people who are the more ready to pay for green hydrogen will get it, and not only the neighbors of the first project. So in a nutshell, it's a chicken and egg. We need some green production. Second, we see a limited risk of bubble because we always start with industrial customers. And third, we need infrastructure to avoid the bubble in any case.
Thank you, Didier, and thank you to all of the panelists for your opening remarks. So I think, my takeaway from that is that, Tanaka-san, you were talking about the golden age is perhaps now in terms of hydrogen. I mean, as in, it's the very start of something that will be different as far as our energy system is concerned, and it's the start of that because it has to be the start of it. In other words, we have no alternatives as we think about moving to a net zero world. Again, there are pivots towards this, as Fiona mentioned, the supply pivot in Australia, politically driven. Again, technology, not taxes, as you mentioned, Fiona, sort of interesting on that. The role of mandates, we heard from Mohit and again from Didier, from Jeroen, the importance of stimulating demand, the issue of pricing carbon, infrastructure, collaboration. And Didier, I'm going to end and come back to you a little bit on this because one analog obviously is over in the LNG market where we talk about, or the industry talks about green LNG, although not everyone likes that label, but it essentially emission offset LNG at various degrees. And what we hear is obviously that it's the end user that is asking for a lower carbon fuel. So, and you mentioned that as well. So that ecosystem that you talked about, the consumer or customers are asking for new fuels, but there is a price associated with that. How pervasive is that demand for a cleaner source across industries? And are there industries from your point of view that are taking the lead on that from your perspective as Engie as you take hydrogen to market? Just give us a little bit more insight onto what industries, and then a little bit more on that. I was interested in your point about the ecosystems that sit around that, if that's okay.
Well, I think almost all industries consuming hydrogen want to have at least some pilot project and some first demonstration that it works. I did mention fertilizer. We have one project in Australia. I did mention explosives. We have one project in Chile. I did mention the mining industry. The mining industry is a very specific case because that's one of the cases where hydrogen may be competitive very soon. For a very simple reason, a lot of mining sites are in very remote places where bringing diesel is very expensive. And therefore, producing green hydrogen on site may be quite competitive. The issue being more today is that you don't have mining trucks using hydrogen. You don't have mining minerals processing using hydrogen, and you need to develop that. But typically that's one of the industry where we see a demand because they want to get rid of diesel, not only for environmental reasons, but because of price.
So do you mind if I hold you there? And Fiona, let's go to yourself in Australia, because obviously we talked about supply in your opening remarks, but I'm just obviously interested. There's the mining link there, and we were talking about your recognition that supply needs to link with demand, but demand in other markets. Is the mining industry in Australia thinking about hydrogen? Again, it might be, my apologies, but just making that link between the two. Be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, it is. And we're certainly seeing leadership in that space from company Fortescue to the point where they've created a smaller child company called Fortescue Future Industries, which is very much seeking to establish itself as a green hydrogen producer and very much a major one globally. That's very much, as far as I can tell, initially about decarbonising Fortescue's operations as a miner of iron ore. Our other miners, I think, are looking at what they need to do, but keeping their cards very close to their chests. And but I'm aware of there being certainly investigations into opportunities in hydrogen. And very much in the Pilbara with replacing diesel in the vehicles there. It's a very expensive piece, and so people tend to be looking at sort of trials and the like. We actually released a white paper last week where we were looking at the harder to abate areas and where to start and how much money it cost. And we quoted the company Hatch, who'd done some analysis for the Green Association for mining, And they had quoted that to replace 3,000 megalitres of diesel in the Pilbara, it was going to cost $28 billion to go to hydrogen once you'd accounted for the cost of solar, the cost of storage and the like. So people are trying the ideas on for size, but you can see those numbers are quite high. Are quite high, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Interesting. Tanaka-san, if you don't mind, I'll come to you because we've got about 15 or so minutes left. But you talked about LNG and the way in which basically Japan has led the way on that in terms of creating that market. But you and I both know we don't have that time. We don't have 50 years. We have 10 years at best, and we're a long way off being where we need to be today. So with your broad experience and depth of understanding, what would you say needs to happen to really accelerate both the access to supply that we've heard about, which is clearly moving forward, but also stimulating demand rapidly to ensure that that supply pull happens, because suppliers like Engie can see the end user is insisting on using green hydrogen as we go forward. Stuff needs to happen. It needs to happen quickly. What is that?
I think, as you have already suggested, the carbon pricing is probably the one. And the IEA's net zero, let's say, emission by 2050 report says by 2050, the carbon price in the developed economy should be as high as $250 per ton of CO2. And for China, Russia, or Brazil, $200 per ton of CO2. So if the clear direction is given by the carbon tax or the carbon mechanism of carbon pricing, then I think let's say investment happens and private sector can prepare for that, because not only government, the private sector is moving much faster. For example, the mega tech firms like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, they are going to carbon neutral by 2030. So, and all value chain or supply chain companies should be the same. And not only mega tech firms, but transportation firms like Mercedes, Toyota, they are saying carbon neutral by 2039. So if this demand side, the big demand side is requesting carbon neutral, I think, all companies should use. I mean, the German steel company is now saying they have to make green steel by using hydrogen.
But who pays for this tonight? Sorry, Tanaka, but who pays for this? Because we've heard Fiona say, there's Hatch did this study, 23 billion to replace diesel. These are large sums of money, $250 a ton of CO2. Someone pays for this at the end of the day. Who pays for this?
Of course. At the beginning, government may push it by the subsidy, or the carbon pricing means that, let's say, transfer of money from one sector to the other. Certainly the consumer in the end should pay the higher prices of products if the carbon neutrality must happen. But without carbon neutrality, we have much serious situation in the future. So consumer must pay for high prices for clean and sustainable and stable world in Earth. So this is, so it's inevitable that some person should pay for that, and it's generally the global consumers who pay for this transition. Otherwise, transition will not happen.
No, and I think that that's the elephant in the room, as the expression goes. I completely agree. There is a price. The price needs to be recognised and it needs to be dealt with. So Mohit, let's come back to yourself in India, because again, I quite liked the pragmatic approach the government seems to be taking there with you, both as supplier and with industry, in terms of a gradual approach to introducing green hydrogen into the economy through mandates. But you also said subsidy. So how is this cost of the movement to green being managed politically within India to make it acceptable?
Let me take a minute here to probably answer and also talk about NTPC. You see, for the people in the room who are not aware of NTPC, NTPC is the largest utility in India, and we supply almost a quarter of the electricity requirements of India. And so far, we have been largely almost 99% based on coal-based power. So for NTPC, energy transition and the movement to decarbonization was inevitable, not exactly a very difficult choice to make. So we have set a target for ourselves to move from whatever number we have today to have a renewable portfolio, which is almost as big in size as coal-based portfolio. Now, when I talk about that number, I also realize that probably a lot of that number of electrons we will not be able to push into the grid, because the grid demand ultimately is a limited number. So even with the kind of growth we expect in India, all of renewable capacity may or may not be able to go. So for us, it becomes a natural choice to find ways as to how to use these electrons. And green hydrogen appears to be a very natural extension of what we're trying to do, converting these electrons to molecules, and which are then used by industries. And the point I was trying to make earlier. So for example, we're already running 3 or 4 pilots. One is for hydrogen-based mobility, one is for production of green methanol, where we are actually going to combine the 2 most important things the world is talking about today. One is green hydrogen, and the other is carbon capture. Put them together, produce green methanol. And green methanol can very easily be used to replace fuel. Even it can be fired in my boilers. And then we're also talking to companies with the gas pipeline operator to start blending natural gas. And we're also running a small pilot on decentralized generation using hydrogen. So these are just steps, baby steps, I may say. But when we move to a larger demand-based thing, so the model which the government is talking about potentially does not involve any subsidy. And it will probably also not have any big backlash for the simple reason, because the mandate is starting at a very low level. For example, even a 1% mandate for the refineries, the fertilizers, is actually going to lead to a requirement of almost, if I get my numbers right, almost 2,000 tons per day kind of requirement for green hydrogen, which is a reasonably large number to begin with. And if I keep doing that year on year for the next 10 years, from 1%, for example, or 2%, whatever the government decides, to say 10% or 20% or 30%.
But
so
Mohit,
the impact in terms...
One of the points you're making, I think, just to push on that, is that the interconnectedness of different sectors to offset each other and to help each other helps build the economic case. Is that's what I heard? I heard, that we can link with other sectors to leverage. If we just think of it on its own, then we kind of stumble over the price and how do we get to the price. If, however, we diffuse it across a broader ecosystem, then perhaps we can get there faster. Maybe a terrible summary, but is that roughly where you're going?
No, I think you did it right. And probably I was taking much longer to come to the same point. But I do agree. The idea is to create a situation where the supplier as well as the user does not have to actually take any part of the supposedly larger bill. And even the user, from a user of, for example, gasoline and all, they also don't feel the pinch. I mean, if I do 20% mandate today, it's going to create a lot of havoc for the entire industry, the user industry. So if we do it in a gradual manner, so it creates demand, it creates visibility, it gets people like us into the sector to start producing green hydrogen or green ammonia. And that's how the whole thing rolls on.
So just quickly on the gradual, I mean, so the mandate, let's say, is at 1%. Is it clear what the mandate is in 5 years' time, or are you debating, discussing, negotiating that? Sorry, again, my ignorance, but is that clarity of direction already in place for industry in India as of now?
So the exact numbers have still not been rolled out. The government, the government has already taken inputs from people like us and the industry as a whole. What we understand, it's a 10-year kind of gradual thing, and it's likely to move from, I think, 1% or whatever that number is to close to around 20-25% at the end of 10 years. So, but the final document, the approved document, is expected to be issued maybe in the next 2 or 3 months. That's what we know.
Okay, all right.
But the direction is very clear. That will be one of the pillars to take it forward.
That's been very helpful, and thank you for that, Mohit. I'm going to return, Fiona, if you don't mind, just to switch gears a little bit. Let's switch to collaboration. supply, you mentioned, we get that. Demand maybe in mines, interesting perspective you gave us on that. But you did mention obviously the link of supply demand and linking to markets so that supply can find markets. What's the issue around collaboration as well? Is Australia doing this on its own, or is it collaborating? And what is the new forms of collaboration that will be needed to ensure we do reach this golden age of hydrogen that Tanaka-san mentioned?
Collaboration really is key, and we are definitely seeing that happen. One of the key areas that there was government announcement just a couple of weeks ago giving an update on hubs that are going to commence in Australia with funding from the government. So 7 major hubs. They're called clusters in other places or hydrogen valleys, but that same concept. We're also seeing the growth of what we're calling clusters, which again is the term clusters used separately in other places, but the sort of communities of practice that are springing up. So down to the small business level in certain regions, we're seeing that kind of collaboration. And at the other end of the scale, we've obviously we've got really good collaboration between Australia and its trading partners and its potential trading partners, including an accord signed with Germany and a number of memoranda of understanding with a number of countries. I think the challenge, though, with all of this is that the good intentions are difficult to translate into action when economic cycles and political cycles are short, but when what we need to do involves genuine, concerted information sharing and risk sharing between the public and the private sectors, and between sometimes competing bodies, to take this very long-term view. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the challenge, and I think probably at the heart of why we're seeing the IEA saying that we've seen this commitment, but the ambition hasn't yet been met with the dollars. In Australia, we're saying the dollars and the planning. How do we coordinate all of this? And I think that's the thing that scares me the most about the energy transition, full stop, but also hydrogen, and how do we overcome organisational inertia and a desire to defend existing ways of doing things, because that's how you make money in markets. How do we get governments over the line to do the things that need to be done when they might not be politically palatable? So I think collaboration is everything, but the challenge is always going to be, how do we match the ambitions that we have to collaborate with the reality?
And if you had a a wand, silver bullet, whatever words we seek to use, what needs to happen to encourage that collaboration in a post-COP26 world? What needs to happen in the next 2 years for this collaboration to work?
I think markets. It's about people biting the bullet, whatever needs to happen to start markets. So contract for difference type models. Governments need to take that step and create that environment for then the private sector to step in and engage and set up a market. I think the challenge, though, is when governments are thinking, oh, well, we'll just sow some seeds or we'll just lay a foundation and now the private sector is going to come in. When there will be entities that are like that, and we've got some of them on the line right now, but the gap to be closed is still so massive that we do need to see, I think, some really significant commitment from governments to do all of the things that encourage markets as well. So there's the contracts for difference, yep. There's official relationships that need to be laid. There's policies to value carbon or to cost it, as well as industry-specific subsidies and the like. And all of those levers need to be pulled simultaneously.
At the same time. Okay, all right, Fiona. We have about 5 minutes left. I've just got one question, which I'm going to direct at Jeroen. And Jeroen, it's about regulation, standards, certification. We're going to be creating a global hydrogen value chain market. over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. I'd be interested in any perspectives you have on developments within that to ensure ease of trading that needs to exist between that. So I'm just going to come back to you on that in a minute. And then I'll ask each of you just to close out, starting with Tanaka-san when we finish with Jeroen. We've had a great discussion so far. We've heard some really interesting points in terms of why the market is moving, and it's moving at pace. There are barriers to overcome. What do we need to do? What advice can we give energy markets and energy regulators to accelerate this over the course of the next 2 to 3 years? And I want each of your views on that. But maybe first, just to yourself, Jeroen, if you don't mind, this issue of creating a new value chain, hydrogen value chain. What needs to be done on regulation standards and certification? And has anything actually happened in that particular area that you're aware of? And maybe supplementary to Didier, if you want to come in on that as well, you're working in this market, that'd be very interested.
Yeah, obviously, I think it's an important topic. That certification of hydrogen and the sources of hydrogen gets sort of set, because otherwise it will be difficult. There's so many discussions around colors and various colors of hydrogen in the system. Even the definitions are agreed on. So if that does not get addressed, I think it will be very difficult for markets to stay competitive and really create a level playing field. Yeah, and especially if you then take into account a topic which we did not really spend a lot of time on today, is there will be export markets and there will be import markets. And thinking about certain export markets, if we talk, let's say, grey hydrogen that will be put to the market, there will be definitely a big demand for it if we want to meet our goals. Yep. But then it needs to be priced right, and a definite requirement is that it is then labeled in that way, and then we can also
got to be labeled.
Yeah, and then we need to, of course, and that is the point you discussed with Fiona. How do we then have the policy measures aligned to it to make that market work? And that can be minimum quotas. It can be carbon cross-border compensations to create level playing field across the various geographies. And I think those kind of things will be need to decide it on in COP26. Again, if we want to meet the urgent timelines, which Tanaka and others talked about today.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yep.
Didier, any follow-up on that or any supplementary on
that? 3 topics. First one, as Jeroen just said, we need a clear, internationally recognized certification system. And contrary to what I have read here and there, it's not color or carbon content, it's color and carbon content. Yep. Because the customer is allowed to know what kind of hydrogen he is buying, or he or she is buying, and how much the carbon content is. Second, we need a carbon price. It's clear, cannot work without a carbon price, and a carbon price means that the countries which have a strong carbon price are entitled to have a carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, because if not, it doesn't work. We all know that. Third, we also need to avoid technical over-regulation. For many people, hydrogen is dangerous, and therefore it leads to over-regulation. The reality is hydrogen is not really more dangerous than natural gas that we have been able to handle for years, for decades. And we need to avoid over-regulation, which put a lot of cost on the industry, on the users. Just an example, the cost of a refueling station in Japan is something like 5 times the cost of the same station in the US, just because of regulation.
Right.
I know that Japan is more densely populated than the US, but still 5 times is a lot too much.
Excellent. Okay, Didier, thank you for that. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so as I said, what I'd like to do is just quickly go round each of you. I'll start with the same order that we entered this discussion. Tanaka-san, the issue really is that, you know, we need to move quickly if the golden age of hydrogen is to be achieved in the way that you describe. Having listened to the debate and the discussion this morning, what are your final remarks into the context of how do we take this forward? What do we need to do to take the debate and accelerate access to both supply and demand?
Yeah, as you say, that everybody recognizes the needs of hydrogen and the needs for the unifying or standardizing or regulations, etc. So it's clear that we need international collaboration, cooperation for the common market of hydrogen. So, and it also covers, it also comes with the kind of voluntary carbon market or carbon market, global carbon market. Otherwise, the proper carbon price cannot be set. So with these infrastructure, I think the government can help by providing the general hydrogen future. I'm asking Japanese government to prepare the comprehensive hydrogen law, for example,
right,
to promote the use of hydrogen and regulate it different from other industrial gas, because hydrogen is different. So some kind of clear treatment of hydrogen by the governments and make it clear and reduce the uncertainty of the future of the hydrogen. That is what we have to do quickly as possible.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. I think that's excellent. The common market of hydrogen, regulation, law, dealing with it as a separate entity to drive it as we go forward. Fiona, your own quick thoughts in terms of how we're going to drive this forward quickly.
Well, I'm aware with time that I'll just keep it short. I'll say political will, and the political will, like everything else that we need, should flow from that. Let's create the markets, but we need political will.
Excellent. Thank you, Fiona. And Mohit?
So thanks, Arthur. So I'll stick my neck out and say one thing, which is really been not accepted very easily. I think we need to end the debate on the color of hydrogen. I think let's try to focus, if you're talking about net zero, decarbonization, minus 1.5 degree and so on and so forth, let's talk about renewable hydrogen and go forward on it. And I echo what Tanaka-san said, we need to have markets, we need to have enough suppliers. In fact, our problem, what we are saying is that we don't have enough people with enough electrolyzer capacity in the world to meet what the demand is. Probably we need to do that.
Okay, I like it. That's setting out a standard and setting out something to move towards. So thank you for that. Jeroen.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add is let's think about a long-term view and really action that. Not being pushed too much by the short-term issue we have at hand. So really set the standard, maybe accept in the short term that we have many colors of hydrogen in the system. That's not the key issue. The key issue is that we set a direction, we stick to that direction, and we then execute that accordingly. So building the infrastructure, supporting the clusters, the markets where we see demand growing, and move from A to B. And that will not happen in 5 years' time. It will take more time, but if we set it right now, I'm sure hydrogen will play an important role. And then it is to COP26, which is now coming, to really do some groundbreaking things. So think about carbon floor pricing, think about some mechanisms that will support it. And a lot of the other stuff has been, I think, addressed previously in this session.
Thank you, Jeroen. And finally, Didier, your own thoughts.
Perhaps some things that we have not really addressed up to now. Also, I agree with most of what has been said. There are two sectors where international cooperation is needed for decarbonization, but where they can afford to pay a certain price for progressive introduction of renewable energy. That's maritime transportation and aviation fuel. And in both cases, the mandatory incorporation of some e-fuels, be it e-methane in liquefied form, be it e-ammonia, be it e-methanol, be it e-crude, whatever, could be a very good point for developing the market, for developing international market. And to support that, we will obviously need some storage, but that's another topic on which government should pay a bit more of attention, because up to now, I think that storage of hydrogen and storage of e-fuel has been a bit neglected.
Thank you, Didier. Well, thank you, everyone, to all of the panelists for what's been a fantastic 60 minutes of discussion with regard to hydrogen. I think all of us are agreed in the discussion that we're not in a bubble in that sense. Yes, there has been an orientation towards supply, but we've heard a number of examples today, specifically from Didier, for example, and also from Mohit, where there is a demand orientation towards this. But demand necessarily needs to be incentivized, and the role of government within that, the role of a carbon price needs to be incorporated as we move forward. In that context, acceleration, speed are vitally important for us as we move forward. And in that way, we need to think about the regulation that exists today. We need to create the standards. As Mohit said, maybe from one point of view, we need to move straight to green hydrogen in certain markets. I might add, Mohit, you might disagree with me on that. In other markets, it might be a gradual. But nevertheless, action is needed so that we can come back to essentially Tanaka-san's kind of opening claim, which is that we are moving towards the golden age of hydrogen. So to all the panelists, thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed the last hour. I hope you have as well. I'll now basically link up with Etna, and we'll have a bit of a discussion with regard to what she heard and observed, and any comments I had. So once again, thank you panelists for a fantastic 60 minutes.
Arthur, and thank you so much. And it's great to be back here for this chat. Wow. I mean, how to overcome industrial inertia, how to pass the valley of death, and indeed how to actually pull it all together and get us to that golden age. There was so much there. And I think without a doubt, you had such great, I suppose, alignment on where we're going. But how we're getting there, we still seem to have a few stumbling blocks, don't we?
Yeah, I think we do. And I think Fiona kind of mentioned the kind of government inertia aspect, is that if the investment and economic cycles are quite short in terms of where people want return, and the government political cycles are short, we're dealing with something that is 10, 20 years in terms of the investment, the development of infrastructure, and we need to get on with it. And I think, you know, I think you saw there maybe the industrial and policy will to get on with it. I mean, you know, no one was questioning it. No one was saying, oh, it's too early for hydrogen, it's, you know, up in the clouds somewhere. There was none of that in any way. And what we heard was that absolutely this is needed. The customer will drive demand. The customers are there, different ways of getting there, but government inertia in certain markets, not all markets, needs to be overcome. And it was great to hear Mohit's example of what's happening in India, because obviously that's going to be, you know, with China, India is, you know, one of the critical markets from a decarbonization point of view. And great to hear that there is movement in that direction. You know, India's largest utility company is very much on that journey and very much behind where that's going. So that was good to hear.
And also, I think he demonstrated the fact that they want to start this, you know, on a smaller scale. The fact the models will not have a subsidy when it happens. And again, I think, you know, getting the momentum going. But I think it's certainly for the Indian market, and you look at such a big market, it's a great way to create the demand, and indeed what everybody was talking about. I was very impressed that Didier is driving a hydrogen car. I could see his frustration with the fact he can only get gray hydrogen for now, but it actually put it in perspective, because, you know, on the consumer market in terms of, you know, just private transportation, clearly that's out there, and the fact there are some filling stations. But again, as he said, you know, and I think he was very optimistic about the fact it's not going to be a bubble, but the fact that there needs to be so much done, the infrastructure needs to be built, and it needs to actually deliver, because it does appear, you know, and get over that big costing element too. I mean, that's huge right now. How are we going to finance it?
Yeah, and I think, you know, linked to that was the both Didier and Mohit mentioned what I might call the creation of ecosystems around an initial point of demand. And, you know, for many of us who work within the energy industry, we often think of, you know, a molecule going to one place. You know, here is, you know, gasoline going to the filling station, here's diesel going to the power station, here's gas going to the power station. Whereas both of them talked about actually there's offsetting that can happen if you create those ecosystems around the initial point of demand. This was the kind of point that Didier mentioned, and I think Mohit then talked about, because you can diffuse some of the costing around this. this, because you get basically a supply base that is broad enough to diffuse that cost. If we're just thinking about a molecule getting to one point of demand, then it's a huge cost that we need to overcome. I mean, a tenfold difference in price between green and blue hydrogen in many markets as of today. But if we start thinking about how a hydrogen ecosystem can be created around, let's say, the steel manufacturer in other different ways, then actually perhaps we can accelerate that. So the creation of new ecosystems, I think, very interesting, vital point. We actually do see that in terms of these clusters that Fiona mentioned in different parts where these hydrogen pilots are taking place. You do see that necessary linkage. But I think that's a critical point, and it kind of links into the kind of dialogue that we need on this. You can't just say, well, what does it mean for steel? It's kind of, what does it mean for steel and everything that sits around steel that can be connected, would be my way of thinking about it.
Indeed, and I think what we've heard even in other panels earlier today too, a lot of people talking about the fact that we have to get started. We have to get started on localization, start these small projects, expand them regionally, and then we can begin to scale. And also I think what Fiona was talking to about its use in mining, and the fact that, what Fortescue is doing in Australia and really looking at it. And I know on that project, they actually want to go straight to green hydrogen and say that there's no need to, hydrogen. It's fascinating for me because I'm doing a big mining conference on Friday. So when everybody has finished with the World Energy Week, they can all go over and watch me on the FT mining conference. There you go. So
good link.
But what color? I mean, what color? Where do we go? This is still, everybody is in a bit of a quandary in terms of what to do. But I would think what I'm hearing is we just have to start getting the hydrogen economy moving, and then we will get to green. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, there's the phrase of, where you stand is where you sit. And what I mean by that is that obviously if you're in the Middle East where you have access to huge amount of solar, there's obviously, and at a price point that is extraordinarily competitive, there's obviously a huge incentive and means by which you can go immediately to a green hydrogen molecule. There are other parts of the world where, for example, where we have existing infrastructure around gas, where gas is being produced, and therefore the move to blue hydrogen would make a logical basically next step. So I think I agree with Mohit's ambition that we should move to green, but I do think it will be, markets will be different on this as we go forward. And I do think that then links into the issue that they talked about standards and certification, because even when we say blue or we say green, there isn't a consistency as of today as to what that means, both in terms of its color, but as Didier mentioned, in terms of its carbon content as well. And I think this, you and I have been at the conferences where we've talked about green hydrogen, and again, the urgent need for standardization and certification that sits behind, green LNG, the need for that, and I think that's an analog for what will be needed in the markets that we sit. So yes, green will be there. I think in certain markets we can move very rapidly to it. In others, it perhaps will be other colors. But if we are in that zone, it really highlights the importance of certification standards and the way in which we manage that from an infrastructure point of view.
It will be interesting too to see who really takes the lead on this. And I really enjoyed what Mr. Tanaka was talking about and giving us a bit of a historical look back on the journey of hydrogen, particularly in Japan. And now it's sort of refocused, so to speak, in terms of where it's coming from and what it wants to do. And again, what's happening in Europe.
No, I agree. And I think, Tanaka-san, are you there?
Thank you. I'm still there.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Very good to see. I like the argument of this demand side driven transformation. Because I think the former transition is more the supply side driven, but this one is a definitely demand side driven. Apple wants their supply chain to be renewable only, and Mercedes make the same thing. If these major industrial players globally moving on the decarbonization of the supply chain, then we have to go with that. Anyway, any company who stay in Asia or Japan or Europe should do the same thing. So this is the demand side driven transformation. So,
but Tanaka-san, let me just interject. I think you mentioned, MITI taking a role in this. And it took a role, every time I've dealt with the Japanese industry, the role of the industrial policy has been an absolute catalyst of change within Japan. And I think it's an analog for the catalyst of change we need beyond Japan in other markets as well to stimulate that demand.
I am trying to reform METI also, because METI's energy agency is supply side thinker. They are too much obsessed with supply side, portfolio. What we should do with nuclear, what should we do with the share of renewables, what the power company should do. So they're obsessed with supply side. So I am arguing that demand side will drive and decide the portfolio.
Excellent.
It's not the supply side.
All right.
So that is what I'm saying.
Tanaka-san,
we've
run out of time.
And indeed, thank you so much for coming back in on that, and always great to see you and have your great insight into it. Thank you so much. Just closing up here, and I'll take a quick word from you, Arthur, but what we heard there from Jeroen as well, really talking about the infrastructure that's got to be put in place, the fact we're going to have an export market, we're going to have an import market. I mean, there's a lot, I think, that has to be still in the planning stages. And again, the political will, the business will, the alignment, I think, that has to happen. There's so much still to do, but I think we're heading in the right direction, Arthur. Yeah,
and absolutely, 100%. It was positive, it was optimistic, but it was also pragmatic and realistic in terms of what needs to get done. So thank you for that, Edna. Back to you.
And thank you so much. And I know later today we're going to be looking at how do we invest for a renewable future, and how do we invest, really in energy for humanity. We'll really be taking a look at that. I really am excited to be looking later in the day when Halima Croft comes on from RBC Capital Markets in a wonderful session entitled "It's All About the Money," or I'm not going to sing that one for you, but it'll be very curious to see what it is. Is it all about the money? So we certainly heard there that it's definitely one component. So really, that was a great panel there, and I think, really pulling that panel together to focus on hydrogen, given all of the great insights that we had this morning from so many people from around the world in terms of Russia, Asia Pacific, Asia, as well as that in Kazakhstan, really looking at it, everybody looking at hydrogen. And we heard about it yesterday too. So I think it is the topic of the season, it's the topic of our time, and it is the focus and the direction that we're certainly going. We have lots more later for you this afternoon. We are by no means finished, but we're going to go to a break very shortly now. Of course, the World Energy Week is all about convening all of you together to bring you the absolute very best in terms of content, in terms of information, in terms of expertise. And we really, the team goes out of their way to make sure that we get many of the best, analysts, many of the best experts, many of the best leaders in the industry sector, in the energy sector, to come and to talk to you. It's something that's very, very important. And it's great that we have their support with the World Energy Council. Really, it's just the depth of knowledge, I think, and the great people that we're going to be able to deliver for the next day and a half. You're going to be very interested, and I want to keep you on board here. The other thing, though, we want you to, check in with each other and have a look at who else is here. We do have the networking space. Just have a look at the sidebar there. It's on the left-hand side of the screen, and then you'll be automatically matched with some participants. So it's definitely worth staying online here and making sure that you do a little bit of networking. We're doing it digitally. I'm sure by now you're used to how it's done, but there are many other people online, and I'm sure they'd love to connect and, have a chat. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we are out there in, social media. So we do want you all to connect and engage. And please send your feedback. Tell us where you are. What are you doing? What are you thinking? We hope we're bringing you what you want, and we hope it's really adding value. Tag us on World Energy Week. That's hashtag World Energy Week. And of course, get your questions ready. Have a look at who's coming up in the afternoon panels and see what questions you want to have in there, because there's never a whole lot of time. But the earlier you're in with a question specifically, you can see who the panel members are. It's really, really important. So as I said, coming up later this evening, we're going to be looking at customers for the future. We're also going to be looking, at Futures Leader. We'll have that wonderful session in terms of it's all about the money. And we're going to then have a great session, of course, at 2:15 this afternoon, where my dear friend and colleague John Defterius, former CNN anchor, and NYU lecturer and all-around general good guy and energy expert. He's going to join us. So at 2:15, John Defterius is back here online looking at energy for humanity. And he has a fabulous lineup. Maria van der Hoeven is on that. Maria Sunner-Fleming is also on it. His Excellency Juan Carlos, and Bob Dudley will be joining him too. So really, you don't want to miss that. That's 2:15 to 3:15. John Defterius will be back on that one. And again, sessions right throughout the afternoon until 6 o'clock UK time. I know we have people from around the world, so we'll stick to the time in London and we can all adjust from there. Keep an eye on the social media outlets. Please engage with us. We still have a full day and a half to go. We have so much, that we want you to be involved with. And of course, all the sessions that we have, done live, we'll have them all recordings. I think most of them are going to be there. And I'm just looking on a little note here that I've just got. They'll be on the website and social media channels. So for myself, Etna Trainer, I'm in the UAE. I'm going to bid you farewell now. As I said, get over to the networking sites, take a little break for early lunch. And then at 2:15, John Defterius takes over the online presentation and will continue with World Energy Week. So thank you all so much, and we'll all keep in touch. Take care.